For years, I've read the cover articles of Newsweekly magazines, and I've seen the television documentaries which quote historians and theologians as making two very familiar claims. Claim number one, that the Jesus we read about in the Bible is not the true Jesus of history. In other words, that Jesus is not divine, that he's just a man. Claim number two, that the Gospels that we have today are not trustworthy historic documents, that they were written to embellish the image of this preacher named Jesus and to make him look divine, and that the stories of his miracles and much of his teachings were simply an invention of the early church. Well, let me deal briefly with both of these.
To begin, there are some people who say that Jesus actually never existed. Because Jesus' name does not appear in any first century document or on any inscription other than what we read in the Bible, then it's supposed that the reliability of what the Bible says about him cannot be verified. Of those people who admit that Jesus did exist, some claim that the stories of his sayings and miracles were entirely made up by early Christians simply to sell people on this new religion, Christianity. The claim has been made that the Gospels were not written to be historical books, but rather evangelical books. That is, they were meant to convert people to a new religion, and they were not meant to be accurate regarding the events and sayings found within their pages. Therefore, some people have assumed that the ancient church sacrificed accuracy for sensationalism, and that the early Christians had no problem making up fictitious stories and teachings in order to spread their new faith.
I disagree with both of these assumptions, not from a theological perspective, but from a scientific and an historic perspective. In fact, I'm going to go even further with you and give you three very bold counterclaims.
Counterclaim number one, there is more historic manuscript evidence for the existence of Jesus than there is of Plato, Homer, Socrates, Buddha, Muhammad, Genghis Khan, Aristotle, or even Shakespeare. Counterclaim number two, we are more sure about the accuracy of Jesus' words than we are about the spoken words of any person in ancient history. Counterclaim number three, there are 9 independent writers, including 4 historians, who write about Jesus in the 1st century. Those are some pretty bold claims, and there are 10 reasons why they are true. Reason number 1, the Bible is not a book. A common error that critics often make, and one that seems to be at the basis of their mistakes, is the assumption that the Bible is a single book. It is not. It's a library. A library of books written over a 1,500-year period by at least 40 authors in 3 languages on 3 continents. The only thing common between these books is the fundamental theme that they all espouse, and it is a fact that the only reason they were canonized is because the Church, at the grassroots level, considered them to be accurate and authoritative. Church officials eventually canonized these books because the majority of Christians all over the world had already done so. Which books were eventually going to be canonized was already a foregone conclusion. Let me go back to this notion about the Bible being just one book. There are 66 books in the Bible. If you had 66 books on your bookshelf, you would not consider them to be one book just because they were all on the same shelf. By the same token, the books of the Bible are not one book simply because of their proximity. They were merely collected to be a library of books, just like you collect books into your own library. The only difference between the Bible and your bookshelf is that the Bible is a closed library. That means that no other books are going to be admitted. The mistake of thinking of the Bible as a single book leads people to believe that the Bible is just a single source of information. But the Bible is not one source of information. Take the Gospels, for instance. The 4 Gospels must be received as 4 separate histories. This leads us to our second point. Reason number 2, there are 4 first-century historians who all write about Jesus. There are 4 Gospels written by 4 different men. Nowhere else in ancient history do we have 4 separate historians all writing about the exact same events and literally quoting the same historic figure. Now, most of the time, modern historians will accept the reliability of some ancient event on the testimony of one historian. Two separate witnesses to the same event is considered to be an open and shut case for the accuracy of any historic event. 3 witnesses is very rare, and 4 witnesses is extremely rare. This means that from a scientific or an historic perspective, the events of the Gospels should be virtually unquestioned. During the Roman era, so many so-called facts about secular history, which are readily accepted by modern scholars, actually depend on the testimony of 1 or at the most 2 historic witnesses. In contrast, the story of Jesus is confirmed by no less than 4 separate historians.
From a historic perspective, this is very big, and it makes the life and the sayings of Jesus the most reliable historic record of his day. Very few objective scientists would question the accuracy of the Gospels. Now, a person with something to prove might question their accuracy. And for anyone who questions the accuracy of the Gospels, you've got to look past their argument and ask what their true motivation is.
Some people say, why don't we have any first-century historians who attest to the existence of Jesus? The fact is that we do. We have 4 of them. That is overwhelming historic evidence for the existence of Jesus. Reason number 3. There are at least 9 literary first-century witnesses who write about Jesus, and as many as 6 eyewitnesses. Consider this. The 4 gospel writers are not the only first-century witnesses to the events of the life of Jesus. There are 5 more canonized first-century authors who all write letters about Jesus. They are the Apostle Paul, Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, Jude, another brother of Jesus, and the writer of Hebrews. The 21 letters written by these 5 authors were collected by early Christians and eventually added to what we call the New Testament. These letters were written during the same time that the Gospels were written, with not one of them contradicting, but rather supporting the validity of the sayings and the stories of Jesus. Among the 5, like I said, were Peter, James, and Jude, who were supposedly all eyewitnesses to the deeds and words of Jesus. That's 3 eyewitnesses, plus the Apostle John, who was an eyewitness, plus Matthew and even Mark, who may have been eyewitnesses to some of the events. This means that it's possible that there were as many as 6 literary eyewitnesses. The evidence suggesting credibility is overwhelming. All of this put together makes a total of 9 separate first-century writers, all saying the same thing. But there are approximately 10 other Christian authors who didn't make it into the Bible, whose histories and letters could have been written as far back as the 1st century. All of them confirming that a powerful man named Jesus did walk on this earth. Here's one example. There's an ancient 1st century book called The Teaching of the 12 Apostles. We know this book today as the Didache, which is Greek for teaching. We don't know who the author is, but some of the things that he says suggest that he was a Jew, and some scholars date this book as early as 50 AD. One thing we know for sure, the Didache was written during the same time that our canonized New Testament books were written. There are a lot of quotations of Jesus in the Didache, and virtually everything in it agrees with our canonized Gospels.
So here you have 9 New Testament authors who attest to the existence of Jesus, all of whom were alive during his lifetime, and possibly several other non-canonical 1st century books which provide the same witness.
John gave us his Gospel, letters, and Revelation about 60 years after the events of the Gospels, but still within the 1st century. The testimony of 4 independent 1st century Gospel historians and 5 other 1st century New Testament witnesses is way beyond credible. From an historic perspective, this is enormous, and it makes the life and sayings of Jesus the most reliable historic record of his day. Anyone who casually denies this is in full denial of the facts. The 4th reason that the Gospels are accurate involves the evidence of written Gospels that predate our canonized New Testament Gospels. Luke says in Luke 1:1, Insofar as many have undertaken to compose a narrative about those matters which have been accomplished among us, even as they gave them over to us, who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. Now, let's stop right there in the middle of the sentence and consider what he just said. This is clear evidence that our four gospel writers were not the only historians in the first century who testified about Jesus. Luke refers to other narratives that we don't have in our possession today, but we don't need them today. Luke included the most reliable of these narratives in his gospel. In fact, he claims that there were many such historians and that they were eyewitnesses. You see, very soon after the life of Christ, people who had known him apparently started writing, and much of what they wrote ended up in Luke's gospel. If Luke's gospel is merely a compilation of these documents, then it's obvious that this gospel represents a much older tradition than the actual date that Luke wrote it. In other words, in Luke's gospel, we are actually reading the accounts of people who personally eyewitnessed the events of Christ's life. This means that in our New Testament, the other gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and John, are all separate, independent historians. In contrast, Luke's gospel admittedly represents the testimony of many historians. Therefore, to our 9 New Testament witnesses, we can now add many others who all contributed to the composite of Luke's gospel. This adds many witnesses to the 9 that have already been named in the New Testament. Now, there's a 5th reason for the accuracy of the Gospels, and it has to do with the critical review of the Gospels by the Church. Think about this. The Gospels were written at a time when thousands of people who knew Jesus were still alive, and these Gospels would have been read and reread by many people who could have legitimately confirmed or denied their accuracy. In other words, the authors of the Gospels wouldn't have gotten away with making anything up. There were too many eyewitnesses critiquing their work. The reason that the Gospels were so aggressively distributed in the early years of the Church is because the community of early believers approved and confirmed the credibility and accuracy of the events described in them.
Now, the 6th reason that I believe in the accuracy of the Gospels is centered around this concept called the gospel of truth. One of the reasons that the early Christians did not fabricate stories about Jesus is because their new faith was based entirely on the foundation of a concept which over and over is called the truth.
Take the Gospel of John, for instance. Consistently, John quotes Jesus as saying that he came to preach truth, John 14:6, that he constantly told them the truth, John 8:45, that they would be messengers of the truth, John 6:13. How absurd it would be for him to fabricate stories about a leader who himself was all about the truth. If John wanted to fabricate stories about what Jesus said and did, you wouldn't expect him to highlight Jesus' own emphasis on truthfulness as much as he did. The two don't go together. It doesn't make sense that he would lie about a message of truth. In the Gospel of John, it says twice that the person who is writing this gospel is telling the truth. In John 19:35, it says, "And he who has seen this has borne witness, and his witness is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth." Again, at the end of John's Gospel, in John 21:24, it says, "This is the disciple who bears witness of these things and wrote these things, and we know that his witness is true." So even there you have the idea that what is written in this gospel is not just believed to be the truth, but known to be the truth. In other words, it's really unlikely that John participated in fabricating lies while being a big advocate of the truth. Reason number 7 for the accuracy of the Gospels is the fact that 3 of the Gospels were written by fundamentalist Jews. And Luke, who was a Gentile, claims that his sources were eyewitnesses, which means that these eyewitnesses must have been Jews. Even modern critics who assume that the Gospels contain many fabrications admit that these stories must have been generated within the Jewish community, because it wasn't until 7 years after Pentecost that the first Gentile church started in Antioch. You can read about that in Acts chapter 11. Note that the stories of Jesus' miracles are being circulated as early as Acts 2:22. Peter said, Jesus the Nazarene was a man attested to you by God with miracles and wonders and signs which God performed through him in your midst, just as you yourselves know. So the people who started all these stories about Jesus' sayings and miracles were Jews. Okay? Well, so what? Remember that in the Jewish religion, giving a false testimony about anything was a sin. For example, in the law, in Exodus 23:1, it says, "You shall not bear a false report." Also, Proverbs 19:5 says, "A false witness will not go unpunished, and he who tells lies will not escape." Now, remember what Jesus said. He said, "Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill them." If the apostles were following a man who said this, would they then violate their own law by fabricating so many stories about Jesus every chance they got? No one would expect them to. Now you may say, well, Gary, we have other Gospels that have a lot of wild and crazy things about what Jesus said and did. For example, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Thomas, and there are others. These are called the Gnostic Gospels. People say, well, how do you know that the stories in the canonized Gospels aren't just as crazy as the Gnostic Gospels? Well, you have to look at the difference between the canonized Gospels and the Gnostic Gospels. 3 of the Gospels in the New Testament were written by first-century Jews. Even Luke's Gospel was written after he compiled the testimony of first-century Jews. All of the Gnostic Gospels were written by 2nd and 3rd century Gentiles. The only Gospels that exist today where we are sure that the authors were Jews are all included in the New Testament.
In other words, you can trust Gospels that were written by first-century Jews. You can't necessarily trust 2nd and 3rd century Gospels that were written by Gentiles. That's why you can trust the Gospels of the Bible. They were written by Jews or from the direct testimony of Jews.
Some people claim that certain aspects of Jesus' life are copied from the myths of several pagan deities who were worshipped in various cultures before the birth of Christ. But take note, these claims don't actually come from scholars, but from amateur skeptics. The reason is they are false, and they are very easy to disprove. Because all you have to do is go back to the ancient documents for yourself, and you will find that none of these claims are supported in the actual historic record. And then you realize what is happening here, that the stories of Jesus' life are not copied from pagan gods, but rather the myths about these gods have been recently and deliberately revised to copy the story of Jesus. Anyone who claims that the stories of Jesus were plagiarized from ancient deities is obligated to prove it with manuscripts and inscriptions, but they can't because they don't exist. Secondly, remember that the Jews were religiously a very separatist people, and no Jew in the 1st century would have plagiarized from a pagan myth to rewrite a portion of their own history, much less to make a pagan god out of a man. That was idolatry, and it was forbidden. So it turns out that the early Christians did not make up stories about Jesus. On the contrary, it is modern critics who are revising the myths of ancient gods in order to discredit the story of Jesus. Reason number 8 for the accuracy of the Gospels has to do with the martyrdom of the apostles. Every one of the apostles was persecuted for their faith, and 10 of them, excluding Judas, were martyred. And the Romans tried to kill the apostle John by boiling him in oil on this very spot. Out of 11 men, you might think that 1 or 2 would be foolish enough to die for something that they did not actually believe. But in the annals of history, there are 11 uncontested legends about the torture and eventual martyrdom of these men, and absolutely no legends about the survival of any of them except John. The question is, who would be willing to die for something that they knew was a lie? Virtually no one would. So why should we assume that 11 out of 11 apostles would? Why would they leave their homes and walk across the world for the rest of their lives for the sake of a big lie? If the early Christians conspired to propagate a lie, then they also conspired to leave their families, to suffer, and to die for this lie. That totally defies common sense. And in my opinion, the only person who would believe that is someone who's trying very hard to prove something. Reason number 9 for the accuracy of the New Testament Gospels is because all of the Gospels are different. Each one has unique material that the other 3 do not contain. Each one of them is told from a different perspective, for different reasons, at different times, in different places, and to different readers. In essence, there were 4 first-century historians who each independently confirmed the reality of the events in Christ's ministry. These differences actually tell us that the truths about Jesus' life are very reliable. If the Gospels were almost identical to each other, it would simply mean that 3 of them were copies of one of them, or that all 4 were copies of another common document. But the fact that the Gospels are all different proves that the writers did not fully collaborate with each other, but drew from many sources, and that the deeds and sayings of Jesus that are recorded in them actually occurred. Here's the 10th reason why the Gospels are true. There is a common misconception that a person in the first century could not be a Christian and credible at the same time. This argument would have you believe that a person cannot be 2 things simultaneously. It would be like saying that a history professor can't be objective because he's a Baptist. At the very heart of this argument is religious bigotry. Think about this. How are the 4 Gospel writers any different than Josephus? Flavius Josephus was a first-century historian who wrote about the history of the Jewish people. Virtually all scholars regard Josephus as highly credible. Josephus was unquestionably an important apologist in the Roman world for the Jewish people and their culture, but he always remained in his own eyes a loyal and law-observant Jew. So for anyone to say that Josephus is believable, but the 4 Gospel writers are not, is to say that one Jew is credible, but 4 Christians are not. Anyone who teaches this is entirely biased against the Christian faith. Some people go so far as to claim that the primitive Christian church had no concept of a physical Jesus. However, we should not consider these claims to be the product of serious scholarship, since the 3 most prominent apostles, Peter, Paul, and John, all say a total of 9 times that Jesus came in the flesh. Luke 24:39 even quotes Jesus as saying that he has flesh and bones. 2 of the Gospels, Matthew and Luke, contain human genealogies of Jesus with real historical people in them. Not one founder of any ancient religion or mythological figure has a documented genealogy. Jesus does. And the 4 Gospel writers all record the life of Jesus as a person who was physically born, went through a process of physical maturity, ate and drank, perspired, breathed, slept, was tired, experienced pain, cried, bled, and died a physical death. In all 4 Gospels, there are instances recorded in which people made physical contact with him. Any commentator who tells you that the Gospel writers were basically good people who invented this mythological Jesus in order to sell people on a new religion has a problem. By telling you that the Gospel writers had no concept of a physical Jesus, they are presuming that you have never read the Gospels. Because the lightest reading of the Gospels will reveal a story about a physical Jesus. If Jesus did not exist, or if these stories were made up about a man named Jesus, then the people who wrote the Gospels were not basically good people. They were bold-faced liars, because there is too much physical reality told in the Gospels. But if the Gospels are a lie, it's not just 4 men who would be liars. To begin, it would be the 12 apostles who were there on the scene, who would have all decided to invent and propagate this lie. And Jesus had a mother and brothers who were also there, so they would be culpable. Then there were also 5 other New Testament writers, and they would have been liars too. And then there were all of Luke's sources who would have been lying, and all the people who knew this man Jesus who would have deliberately lied when they spread the gospel orally. And then there was everyone who knew Jesus, who read the Gospels, who would have deliberately deceived everyone by confirming them to be true and copying them for distribution. Thousands of people who lived at that time, who were actual eyewitnesses, would have had to have been liars. Well, that didn't happen, because it totally defies common sense. There are too many witnesses in the first century, too much evidence that what is written in the Gospels is actually true. A true scientist is going to constantly keep an open mind, with the possibility that any presentation of the evidence could dramatically alter their long-standing conclusions. A true scientist comes to the facts with nothing to prove, no positions to protect, and they will follow the truth no matter where it leads. However, even among scientists, it's very rare to find such objectivity. This is because research is often combined with pride, ego, cultural bias, or someone's traditional belief system. In other words, it's just easier to believe what we've always believed and then seek out a community that will support that belief. Can someone be a follower of Christ and yet be an objective historian? I believe you're looking at that person. In my career, I've attempted to be a faithful student of the teachings of Christ with the objective of maintaining absolute historic accuracy. And as you read through the merged Gospels, you'll very soon discover that historic accuracy is my passion. And when new facts are presented to me, my belief system is open to constant revision. This, I believe, makes me an objective historian. I believe that the fourfold Gospel is an historically accurate account of the life and the teachings of Jesus Christ. And this is why I've dedicated my life to studying them and to teaching you what I've learned. My commitment to you is that I will always be true to good science and the scientific method. That method has brought me to the place where I am right now. If you haven't done so already, I'd like to invite you to watch the video overview of the merged Gospels, and then watch the video about how I wrote the book. You're going to want to get a copy of the merged Gospels for yourself, and then get ready for a video walking tour as we go through the Holy Land, literally and spiritually retracing the steps of Jesus.